Okay, so let's start again with the nature versus nurture debate in psychology, and be very careful with this debate. Students make huge mistakes with this. What do? Well, they actually get it all mixed up with approaches in psychology, and they will end up talking about nature equals biological model, nurture equals behaviorism, learning theory. Well, that is not what they are looking for in this section of the A level. What they're really looking for is, why is there the nature-nurture debate? Okay, not what it is. Actually, why is this whole debate happening? How did it start? And what is psychology doing with it? That is AO1. And what are they looking for AO3? Well, for AO3, for evaluation, they're looking for what are the implications of there being this debate. So let's start with that important premise and not make huge mistakes with this debate. Okay then, let's get going. Okay, so let's start with some 3 key terms which I suggest you actually learn off by heart. And I've actually put this whole sheet in the description box below the video. So I would really suggest that you stop the video, that you cut and paste it, and that you have it right in front of you, and you make a few notes as you're going through this very tricky debate. That's the best way to go about it. All right, so there are 3 key terms. Learn them as they are. They could even come up for 2 markers. Heredity. This means anything which is genetically programmed about you. So this means the way you look, the way you talk, the way you walk around, but also the way you are as a person. It could even be your personality. Okay, so that is heredity. When we talk about environmental factors, we mean anything, absolutely anything which is not genetic. So this could be your early childhood, of course, but it could be anything which has happened to you, even in the womb. Finally, when we talk about interactivism, now students get this a bit wrong sometimes, so you need to listen up. This does not simply mean nature and nurture interact together, so we can forget there is a debate. Nature and nurture go together. No, it doesn't mean that. It actually means that they have to go together. That's a completely different point. That they must go together, that they have to interact. And when they do interact, we need to study that interaction in psychology. Okay, so now let's go on to some AO1 points, of which I've got 5 for you. Let's start with the first point here. Now, you don't have to learn all 5 AO1s that I put here. You could learn, I would say, 3. If you're absolutely stuck for time, 3 would be enough. But you need to write some notes around them as you're listening, and you need to really understand them. Now, the first point is a very important point. I wouldn't want to miss this out. Why? Because this whole debate didn't start with psychology. It actually started way back in the 17th century. So there was this guy called Descartes, who was a nativist, and he argued that all of our behaviour is inherited. Everything about us is actually coming from our biology, but he didn't use the word biology, and he didn't use the word DNA. They didn't know about DNA then. So he was a nativist. You must call him that. And these nativists are actually philosophers, okay? And they're not psychologists. So again, don't call these guys psychologists. And the guy with the completely opposite argument was called Locke. And he was what we would now not really call a scientist, but he was on the beginning of science side of things, okay? And he argued that we are born a blank slate. He was an empiricist. And when we think of that word empirical now, we think of it as being strictly scientific, but he wasn't quite on that side of things then. So it's a very complex thing. All you need to know is that there was this guy who was supporting nature side, and there was the other guy, Locke, who was supporting nurture side. And therefore, this is the key point, that this whole debate started centuries before psychology even began. Why is that important? That is really important because we cannot expect psychology to solve this debate. That's a very deep point to make. We cannot expect psychology to take on this debate, which has been going on for centuries in philosophy and in religion. It's not just in psychology. And, we cannot expect psychologists to decide, is it nature versus nurture? It's a debate which is far-reaching into all areas of human experience. So if you've written those notes down and you can explain it like that, you're making not just an AO 1 point, but you will actually get some AO 3 marks as well for talking about this. Right. So let's now go on to point 2 and 3. Now these points go together. These are saying that we can measure nature and we can measure nurture factors when we study people's behaviour in psychology. And they're actually saying that we have some reliable, underline the word reliable, measures. The first measure is the heritability coefficient, which is from 0 to 1. And this is like all the coefficients. It can be very low, like 0.23, or it can be very high, like 0.8. And if we look at IQ, for example, that is 0.5. So when we get, 0.5, we are really seeing that that is nature or nurture. We can't be sure. So to be really sure we've got nature side, it would be 0.678. And to be very unsure nature's really got a big impact there, it would be 0.1 or 2 or 3. So that's a measurement for how far nature is involved in anybody's behaviour. And it's a very advanced coefficient. We can actually do a scientific experiment where we can say we will not include in this particular correlation certain factors such as your diet or your parents' behaviour, well, maybe not parents' behaviour, but your diet or your exercise routine or your education or where you were brought up and all sorts of factors. And that's an advanced thing which you would do if you went to university to study psychology, advanced statistics. Now, that's okay for measuring nature, but for nurture, we don't use that sort of statistic. Okay, what we use here is levels. Now, these levels are either wide levels or narrow levels. So a narrow level would be something in your environment from which there is no escape. And a really good example of that would be the womb. So if you had any influence on yourself in the womb, then that would be very narrow because you couldn't escape. So let's say your mother was taking drugs, or your mother was drinking maybe a lot of alcohol or whatever, or she was having a very upsetting experience and had high sort of cortisol levels. All of this biology will actually affect you in the womb itself. So it's actually not a biological thing, it's an environmental thing because you're in the womb. If you weren't inside her body, you wouldn't be impacted by it in the same way. So that's a narrow level. I'll go on to the next slide now. And so a wider level would be your culture, because everything about that would be subtly, not really directly having an impact on you. Or your family is a slightly wider level. So the narrow level would be your mum and dad around you all the time if they were. And the more wider level would be your cousins, your aunts, uncles, and people who you didn't see very much, okay? So it's a narrow level or a wider level. 4. Now, this is a very important point again to get just right. Okay, so we can say there is nature, nurture, but which is more influential? there is no way that we can, we can ultimately say which is more influential. So try to get this point. Yes, we can measure nature with the coefficient. Yes, we can measure nurture with the levels. But even if we are measuring them, we can't say which was the ultimate one which had the most influence on any person. I hope you get that. Because, let's say you've got a really high level impact from your culture. We can't say that that was more important in this behaviour than your biology, than your nature. We can't say. We can only argue there was a really big influence there. You need to think about this. And so therefore, we now tend to say, well, since we can never say for sure, even though we can measure nature and we can measure nurture for any one behaviour, since we can't say for sure which was the ultimate cause of any behaviour, we tend to think of an interactivist approach to everything, every single behaviour. And a really good example is is this one here on the sheet. So we could argue that a child's innate way of behaving, that means like a temperament, not a personality. So this would be like if they're very as a baby, if they're very noisy babies or they're very quiet babies, that's a temperament, would actually be interacting with the mother's way of behaving. So therefore the mother will behave differently to a baby who is very quiet than to the baby who is very noisy. And that interaction between the mother's reaction, so the mother might be more soothed by the baby who is very quiet and might be slightly more loving towards them, dare we say it, than she would be towards the baby who is more troublesome to keep quiet, because that's just human nature. It's really hard when a baby's making a lot of noise, and it can impact on people's nerves. And even the poor old mother, she's not an angel, she's a human being, and she can get impacted by that. So mothers react differently to different children according to their temperament, and therefore nature, which is the way the baby is innately, and the mother's reaction to the baby, the mother's interaction with the baby, which is nurture, are going together, and they cannot be separated. That's a very good example of it. And then finally, if you want to use this point, you don't need to, but I think it's a very good point if you can learn all five, is, well, let's now discuss this model that is used within psychopathology, known as the diathesis stress model. Now, if you've been doing schizophrenia or maybe anorexia within your A-level, then you will have studied this. If you've not, and you've not done those options, then you may want to leave it out. But if you have done anorexia, actually, no, everybody's done some psychopathology, haven't you, in paper 1. So everybody should know about this model. I think we brought it into phobias. But in any case, I think that I wouldn't want to use this AO1 point unless I'd done schizophrenia or anorexia, or I don't know what other disorders you do. I choose those options for my students. So anyway, if you have done them, then you want to bring it in. So this is arguing that within psychology, the nature-nurture debate is very crucial when we are looking at mental illness. So when we look at schizophrenia, for example, we know that there is a genetic component. When we look at anorexia, we know there is a genetic component, but it needs to be triggered. And the trigger from the environment will be different in either disorder. So the trigger for schizophrenia might be family dysfunction, or the trigger for anorexia might be ongoing depression or like a life change. It can be many things. Okay, so another trigger for schizophrenia might be having a mother who is schizophrenic, or maybe having a dysfunctional family, or again, a changing event in your life which is major. So that is an interaction of nature versus nurture, and therefore this model argues that you need to be stressed enough or to have a stress thing, if you like, from your environment to ultimately trigger off the nature side, the genetic side. So that's why it's a very useful, nature-nurture debate going together is very useful when we're looking at mental illness within psychology. Okay, now let's go on and look at some evaluation points. Right, the first evaluation point is epigenetics. Now, when we are looking at evaluation in this debate, be very, very careful. You're not saying, oh, the debate works or the debate doesn't work. We know there's a debate. There's no debate about it. There is a debate, and we know it's been there for a long time. And you know, we've already said that psychology can't work it all out. And that was in the first day at one point. So now we're going to look at some hard evidence that your genes really alter over time, and therefore the nature side of this debate is evolving because new research is really coming in all the time to how your environment mixes in with your biology, and this is known as epigenetics. So your genetic activity will actually change without the code changing. So the code is the same, and you will give that to your children, and they will look like you and maybe act like you on many personality variables. But if you've had some sort of trauma in your life, that will actually have an impact on your genetic blueprint. And you don't need to talk about it in a very intense biological way. You can just use what I've said here. And therefore, you will be sending on this new genetic blueprint to your children and even to their children. There was a crucial experiment done around this using lab mice. I'm not very nice using animals, I know, I don't agree with it, I'm totally opposed to it, but here it is. They used mice and they gave them electric shocks when they were exposed to a certain smell, a perfume. And the amazing thing is that these mice, by the way, who became very fearful of this smell, so they've been actually, that's actually going to use a behavioral approach, okay, to make them scared. So think of little Albert here, but we're using mice. And they were afraid of every time they actually smelt that, even though there was no electric shocks, they showed a fear response. So they've been conditioned successfully to be afraid of that smell. Well, that's just them, but no, it isn't. Because when they went on to have babies, and by the way, they were not pregnant during the first exposure to that smell. When they went on later to have babies, their babies who never had any electric shocks at all were afraid of that smell. And even more impressive, when those babies went on to have babies, so the grandchildren mice of the original experimental mice were also afraid of that same stimulus, of that perfume. So that is very strong, hard evidence that something in your life, which is a major trauma, you know, will impact your genes, and that will go through the generations. So what is this, a plus or minus? We don't need to think about that. We don't need to say supporting the debate or not. What you need to say is this is new evidence of how strong nature would be, but it is also evidence of the interaction with the environment, which is not just interacting on your behavior now, but is actually interacting on your genetic blueprint, on your DNA, which will affect all the generations after you. So it's an amazing thing. I would Google it and look into it if you really want to get into it. Okay, so I think I've got another 3 points for you. Maybe I have got 3. Anyway, here's another one that is coming from a different side now to like evaluate this big debate. When we look at, I've just had something come up on my computer there. I hope that didn't come up on the screen when I put this in. Anyway, It was just some news, guys. Okay, extreme nativism, nativism, sorry, that nature is your destiny, has been highly controversial and has led to what is known as eugenics. Now, what eugenics is, you think of Hitler and extreme people like that, who have suggested that we need to manipulate race and we need to get rid of certain characteristics or certain behaviours. They've tried to do that. Or we need to get rid of everybody who is disabled in some way. It's horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. That's what can happen if you really believe that nature is in control. Then the only way to manipulate human society will be to either sterilize people or to kill people and stop them having babies. So that's nasty, nasty stuff, eugenics. So that's what may occur if you really say nature is having all the say here. But if you really go for the other side of the debate, some nasty stuff can happen then as well. E.g., you might develop something known as aversion therapy. Now, aversion therapy was a way to decondition people and to change their behaviour that was used particularly in the 1960s for things like if you were gay. So again, completely wrong, completely unethical, but that was going on. And many gay people would actually say, yeah, I need to have that therapy, please, because it was such a hard thing to be gay at that time. It was actually criminal for men. So you can understand how people may have been bought into that, but it didn't work. And the idea was that that's from the nurture side of the debate. So we can decondition you. I think aversion therapy is still around, actually, in maybe not very sort of healthy ways. Still, it's I think it may be used for alcoholism. You want to Google it and see if it's still available for alcoholics. I think there is a drug which alcoholics can be given, which is a sort of antibiotic to make you sick every time you drink. Well, that is a form of aversion therapy. And again, what we're arguing is the theory behind these rather questionable behaviours and therapies, and certainly questionable as far as eugenics is concerned, is the nature-nurture debate. So that's the point, okay? When we go to an extreme and we say nurture is it, nature is it, rarely this can develop some rather nasty consequences. Third AO3 point. There is the issue of shared and unshared environment. Now, individual differences mean that even siblings who are raised together may not have had the same environment. And this can particularly happen when there's when there's a big age gap. So look at your own family and think, how like are you to your little brother, little sister, big brother? Did you actually have the same environment as a child? Think about this. Well, things might have altered, like you may have lived in a different home. One parent may have left the home, there may have been divorce, or there may have been something going on when you were born and the first years of your life that was not going on when your sibling was around. So your parent may have been unemployed, there may have been more trouble, it may have been a nicer environment for your siblings. So you do not have the same environment, even though you are together and you are raised in the same home. There may be lots of environmental factors which may be different for siblings. And it's not just siblings, by the way. This may be also twins, okay? Because, twins raised together, not as much so, but it could impact as they grow older. Not when they're little, but as they grow older, because different things happen and twins can be influenced differently, okay? So that's why twins raised together do not always show the perfect concordance rates. Now, the biggest thing, okay, within psychology, which I haven't really got on this sheet, but just want to take a few notes on this, is that nature-nurture in psychology has always required us to search out twins, particularly identical twins who are reared apart. We really want to get hold of these guys. Why? Because one was reared with the biological family having the influence of their like shared environment, and the other twin was raised not with the biological parents. So if they have things in common, we can definitely support nature. And we do support nature looking at twins who've been separated. So you need to Google it and see the amazing things in common they do have. Like they got married on the same day, or even very, very weird stuff can happen that makes you think, golly, nature's winning all the way, you know. But no, it's not, because even then there are environmental factors which we cannot rule out. As I said before, within psychology, with the interactivist approach, even if it seems to support nature, we cannot say for sure that nurture didn't have an impact. We can never say that. It's always going to be interactivist. And so this last AO3 is very important. When we look at the idea that there is nature, nurture going together, we come up with this rather weird thing, but very interesting thing. That we actually have a say in our nurture. We construct our own nurture. Okay, so what would be going on here is, if you look at yourself in your school or you look at people around you, you will see how you're doing this. So when you got to year 9 particularly, so in year 7 you were just put into school and you made friends who were like available to you, and you tended to choose people who were like near to you, normally sat next to you in class, became your friends. Look back on it. When you got into year 9 and you're more powerfully in control of your destiny, so to speak, you choose friends who are like you. So if you're a naughty kid, you sit with the naughty kids at the back of the class. If you're a very good, well-behaved child, then you would want to be around those kids. And the naughty kids don't want to be with you if you're a well-behaved child. And you don't want to be with those naughty kids creating havoc in the class. Anyway, do you? You find them really silly and boring, right? So, and when you get into sixth form's a very good one to look at, because you tend to make new friendship groups then very often. And often you're very particular then, you know yourself a lot better, and you seek out those individuals who are like yourself. They got the same interests as you. They behave like you. You look at all your friendship groups. Yeah, I know you're all different in like your personality ways, but you have a lot of stuff in common, don't you? And look at the people who you're not friends with. That's the best way to do it. And say, yeah, they're quite different to me. Well, that is constructivism. So what has gone on is that you have taken an active role in choosing your environment. And therefore, this happens very early in life, though. It can happen very early. So I'm making it sound like it's only later in year 9. But actually, you know, what I'm arguing is in year 9, it's really obvious and you can see it happening. But look at little kids in the playground. All the ones who are being really naughty and aggressive, they've got something in common. That's why they're hanging out together. The kids who don't like aggression, they'll be getting away from those kids. So we seek out our environment. And therefore, your nature will want you to be with the children who are like your nature. And this will increase the likelihood of you maybe being aggressive or whatever. Okay, so there we have it, the nature-nurture debate. I do hope this was useful for you, and you have everything which you need on these sheets for a 16-mark answer, or for anything else they can throw at you. So good luck, everybody.